the last session of the day, in some ways the most important, because we don't make this transition that we need to make to a clean, green, resilient economy without strong governments, without governments helping us to shift, not alone, but in partnership with capital and the finance sector. This is the secret of change. Joining me in this session, we are lucky to have Shinichi Kihara, who's the Deputy Director General for Environmental Affairs at the Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry in Japan. Japan, as you might know, has adopted robust 2030 emission reduction targets, as well as 2050 targets, and METI has been leading the work in Japan on how to achieve those, working closely with the Kaitenren, with industry and with other ministries to build on the green bond market that's already got going. We've also got Kenneth Huey, who's the Head of Market Development at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Hong Kong beat Singapore to doing a green bond by a country mile, I'm afraid. They've doing some great work. Singapore's catching up, of course. They're doing some great work on building the green economy in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong as a gateway to China. We will have Lauren Sorkin on stage with me in a minute, Executive Director of Resilient Cities Network, and Michael Paulus, the Managing Director of and Head of Public Sector Group at Citi. Maybe Lauren and Michael, if you're here, come on up. In the meantime, just a couple of things I want to say. We need clarity of targets. You know that. That's what the taxonomy conversation is all about. But we also need to tilt our economies, our societies, and our policy frameworks to being green, to supporting the transition. We've published just today, especially for this, a draft of 101 ideas for government to achieve 1.5. I mentioned it earlier. It's on our website. We'd love you all to look at it and to give us some feedback about it. It includes, the agenda includes risk support, guarantees, blended finance, as was discussed at the MAS conference 2 days ago, de-risking, as well as sovereign green bond issuance, as well as things like green trade windows, and so on and so on. It's a big agenda. Above all, the pipeline of deals have to grow, and that's the collaboration between the public and private sector that's necessary. Today, thank you for joining me, Lauren, Michael, on the stage. Today, I'd like to start the remarks by inviting Shinichi Kihara from METI in Japan, if we can get the screen working, to kick us off with his remarks about what is METI doing? How are you going? Because, of course, we're watching, and I need to let you know that Japan has announced a program of green transformation bond, sovereign bond issuance, amounting to $147 billion equivalent in yen, which is fantastic, going to support liquidity and growth of the market. So METI's work is important in many ways. But please, sir, go ahead.
Yes, hello everybody. Hi, Sean. Good evening from Tokyo. I'm Shinichi Kihara from Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. I'm very happy to participate in this important and timely CBI seminar today. I would like to highlight Japan's focus on transition. How does it work? How it is spreading around internationally. And I believe you have a slide set prepared. May I ask you to put on the screen?
Team, can we get the slides up, please? While the technicians are working that out, there seems to be some technical hitch. Perhaps I can just get you to start off on your remarks, and the slides will magically appear. Oh, look at that, just as I said it.
Yes, so starting from this, this is a front page. You can see we have common summit goal of 2050 carbon neutral. But our approach is various pathways to lead to that summit. And some are walking, some are using bikes, and some are flying. So different pathways for different countries and different industries, and using different technologies. That's how we see this whole journey of carbon neutral. Can you turn to the next slide? So why is transition finance beneficial? Achieving carbon neutrality is very important, and at the same time, it is a very challenging task. The challenge is not all countries and industries have the zero emission option today. Some reasons are technology is yet to be developed, or still too expensive in the hard-to-abate industry sectors, or geographically net zero resources like solar and wind is not abundant in some areas. So countries and industries have range of pathways towards the goal of carbon neutral, depending on their own conditions. Such countries or industry that cannot leapfrog today normally faces divestment from banks or investors and find it difficult to make decisions on steady transition. What is strongly needed is a financial mechanism that support their steady efforts of transition, following their dynamic trajectory towards the future net zero commitment and strategies. Japanese government takes lead in establishing a transition finance mechanism. Through the transition finance, we aim to realize both growth and decarbonization by leaving nobody behind in our global challenge towards carbon neutral goal. Next slide. So the government of Japan has implemented three-step policy tools for transition finance. Starting from the left, firstly, METI, together with Financial Service Agency and Ministry of Environment, formulated the basic guidelines on climate transition finance last year. This is in line with the internationally recognized Transition Finance Handbook by the ICMA, International Capital Market Association. Secondly, METI has published the sector-specific roadmaps one by one for 7 hard-to-abate sectors: iron, steels, chemicals, electricity, gas, oil, cement, and paper pulp. Today, we are working on additional roadmap on automobile. And thirdly, to promote the new mechanism, METI has selected model cases using transition finance and have subsidized their certification process. So far, we have selected 12 good cases amounting to $2.5 billion in project procurement. Next slide. Compared to other financing tools, the uniqueness of transition finance is that companies' commitment and strategy to net zero is required. Sector roadmap is a key guiding tool. The roadmap shows existing technologies, shows various technologies, options towards 2050, incorporating both existing technologies and future available technologies with the timing of their practical application. Estimated CO2 emission associated with the introduction of the technologies are also shown. The roadmap provides credibility to the transition finance mechanism from 3 aspects. First, the roadmap are comprehensive. The 7 sectors covers approximately 70% of total CO2 emission in Japan. The coverage will expand to 80% when we add automobile this year. Secondly, the roadmaps are ambitious, as all sectors aim to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 and in line with Paris Agreement. Thirdly, the roadmaps are feasible, as implementation of technologies in the roadmap are backed by national policies and internationally shared materials and IEA's roadmaps and scenarios. The roadmap is intended to be a handy tool for both companies and the financial sector. Companies can refer to the roadmap when they explain the adequacy of the new facility or project that they are going to introduce. On the other hand, financial institutions can use the roadmap as reference to evaluate if companies meet the criteria to be deemed as transition activities. The roadmap is also a living document which will be updated if necessary in accordance with technological development, needs by financial sectors, and geopolitical situations. Next slide. Japan's transition finance roadmaps refer to best available science-based scenarios and assessments. They build on intensive discussion involving experts from banks, asset owners, rating agency, relevant industries, and econometrics modelers and others. Brushed up through such bottom-up process, the roadmap gains credibility from both industry side and financial side. Next slide. Have a quick glance on roadmaps examples in power sector on the left and steel sector on the right. You can see the shape of the trajectories are different as the key technology of hydrogen reduction ion making kicks in the 2040s according to the best available science today. As such, each sector has unique roadmap. Next slide. We recognize that the need for transition finance is becoming stronger internationally. Active discussions on transition finance are taking place in various venues, including the G20, OECD, and private sector initiatives like G-Funds. And just yesterday, the Net Zero Banking Alliance just released the Transition Finance Guide. In the chapter on stock-taking existing frameworks, they refer to the ICMA, International Climate Market Association, and also the CBI, the Climate Bond Initiative. Congratulations, Sean. And then EU taxonomy, and also Japan's transition finance guidelines. Next slide. The International Capital Market Association, ICMA, in their transition finance guideline, points to Japan's sector roadmaps as one of the verification tools to prove appropriate scientific base. Next slide. Asia-Pacific region is the center of gravity of energy today, accounting for 40% of global energy consumption. Reducing greenhouse gas in the region is very important for the international community. While Asia's energy demand continues to grow, it faces challenges such as its high dependence on fossil fuels and the uneven distribution of renewable energy sources. In such situation, the investment will only add socio-economic costs such as job losses and economic burdens. Next slide. So Japan's efforts on transition finance is not closed inside Japan. We support the wider spread of the concept in emerging countries, especially Asian region, where energy demand is expected to grow along with their economic growth. So spearheaded by METI, energy ministers in Asia supported the launch of Asia Transition Finance Study Group, led by over 40 private financial institutions and others last year. This ATF study group aims to provide practical guidelines for transition finance in the region. Next slide. And just last week, in the Asian Green Growth Partnership Ministerial Meeting, participated by energy ministers from ASEAN, Middle East, and others, the Asia Transition Finance Study Group has released the Asia Transition Finance Guideline and Asian Transition Finance Activity Reports. Japan will continue our support for establishing transition finance in the emerging countries, backed by our excellence in this field. Next slide. Sorry, this is the last slide. So in closing, Japan's transition finance mechanism is a complementary framework to provide support to industry making efforts in serious transition, which may not be covered by taxonomy solely. Transition finance is dynamic and credible framework backed by comprehensive, ambitious, and feasible sectoral roadmaps. In addition to transitioning our domestic industries, Japan will support Asian countries to make steady progress towards realistic transitions while maintaining a balance between economic development and people's lives. Thank you very much.
Shinichi, can I say that is incredibly exciting? Well, I mean, that was rich in detail, but the extent to which METI is looking across the industry and developing these programs and now engaging, this has all happened since we've seen the announcements early last year, the 2030 and 2050 guides. I know you've been working very busily, but this is very exciting to see, honestly, and it's thrilling to see. Now, I'd be very interested to engage with you about some of the detail around steel and cement. As you know, we've published our cement criteria today, we've published steel criteria, and I've had this long-running discussion with the Japan Iron and Steel Federation about the extent to which we can shift to green hydrogen DRI rather than have to use gas. But the discussion is there. And that, everyone, is a taste of the change that we're seeing around the world now. With Japan, with the work of METI and others, with the US, with the passing of the Climate Act and the massive subsidies to green hydrogen, to various other activities, with the work in Europe now of Repower EU, fueled by, of course, the war in Ukraine, that's pushing Europe to rapidly scale up renewables. You hear the gas story, you hear the coal story. What you don't hear is the extent to which renewables and energy efficiency are being pushed through as the logical extension, the idea what's under this global change is underway, with big implications for investors and for banks. And I guess for financial regulators too. Kenneth, speaking of which, Hong Kong has been wrestling with this issue about how to shift the economy over, finance sector can take advantage of it for the last few years. Tell us a little bit, a couple of highlights about what you've done and where your thinking is going in terms of this global change that we've seen, the extraordinary change in China that we've seen, the 30-60 guidelines, or rather targets, I should say, and now US finally coming back on stream and Japan on stream. What's the Hong Kong Monetary Authority perspective?
Well, thank you very much, Sean, and it's great to be here. I'm also very excited to hear about what Matty is doing in Japan. The situation in Hong Kong is slightly different because, as you know, Hong Kong is just a city. So the carbon footprint of Hong Kong itself is relatively small, and we also have a very service-heavy economy. So 70% of the carbon emission in Hong Kong come from electricity generation, and 90% of that 70 comes from building. So the approach that we go about reducing carbon is slightly different, quite different, I'll say, from Japan. That's one part of it. And the other part is that Hong Kong has always been the kind of gateway and the hub connecting mainland and the international financial market. And as you rightly point out, China has this very ambitious 30-60 carbon neutrality roadmap, achieving peak carbon by 2030 and then achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. So depending on which estimate you use, the amount of money, the amount of investment needed to achieve that target is talking about 100 trillion RMB upwards. So it's a huge amount of money, and a lot of it would have to come from international capital market, and that's how we kind of in Hong Kong see our role in climate finance, in carbon transition financing in general. As to what we've been doing, I think similar to what many of our counterparts across the world, we're focusing on regulation for sure. So part of it is climate risk management. So to make sure that asset manager, banks, etc., appropriately take into account the risk that their asset, their portfolio pose to them from transition, from physical risk, so that they can properly account for it and then shift their investment and lending to more greener purposes. So that's one part of it. And disclosure as well. Previously, we've made commitment to do TCFD disclosure by 2025. And now with ISSB going on in full steam, we're also kind of participating in the process. So that's one part of it. And I believe that regulators across the world are also busy doing. We are also focusing on some of the key hurdles in terms of the ecosystem. So things like capacity building, things like data. I think I see Lauren nodding, and I'm guessing that as NGO in the private sector as well, you're facing the same issues, and we're hoping, and we're actually working with the private sector university to address these. And then finally, there's the awareness aspect. I think in Asia we're slightly lacking, to put it politely, our European counterpart, for example. And the Green Bond program that Sean, you mentioned at the beginning is one of our efforts to kind of really bring this up people's agenda. Earlier this year, we did a retail green bond, quite heavily oversubscribed by the Hong Kong citizen. I think partly the investment proposition was quite attractive at the time, but also I think people are getting, to know more about this green investment and are hoping to participate in Hong Kong's carbon neutrality plan as well. So that's in a nutshell what we've been doing.
Kenneth, really things have changed in the last 5 years in Hong Kong since you started doing the Green Bond program. We're now, I would say every financial institution I come across in Hong Kong has got a green finance component to their work, whereas literally it was absent prior. So this is the power of sovereign issuance, or sub-sovereign in your case, I have to say, but government issuance in the program, which can really drive changes, hasn't it? Are you seeing that? Am I right in saying that, or as an outsider?
Yes, I certainly think so. I think we're seeing two key changes. One is within banks. Obviously, they participate in our green bond program, some of them as distributors, some of them arranger. So they kind of come to understand a little bit more how this works and then realize there are opportunities that are out there. But I think there are also the kind of broader ecosystem building effort. We see green external reviewer coming on board, professional service provider coming on board. And that really help not just the government, but also other corporates and other even SME that are interested in doing green financing to really jump on this bandwagon.
You fired up the ecosystem. That's an incredible achievement, really, and something we can learn about everywhere else. But of course, there's a different kind of issue facing us now, because Shinichi talked about the mitigation agenda in Japan, which is especially critical in an economy that's still relatively high carbon, and there's a lot to be done. But one of the things that Japan teaches us too is around resilience. The last big episode of climate change was in the 1600s, where we saw 2 degrees cooling. And we lost a third of the world's population, according to historians, from war, famine, and pandemic in the 1600s. We had floods, we had years without sun, and therefore famine. As a result, all sorts of things happen. Now, the theory is it's because we killed so many American Indians in the 1500s with measles and smallpox that whole civilizations disappeared in the Amazon, and the forest regrowth, according to research at Stanford, it was so strong that it sucks so much carbon out of the atmosphere, sort of slightly hopeful for sequestration, that it cooled the planet. Now, this is research from one university, I'm going to say contested, but very interesting thought. We certainly had global cooling in that particular period, and there's one region that survived better than any other region. And this was a region where a new government had come into power at the beginning of the region, the Tokugawa regime. And they took a very aggressive stance around ensuring that citizenry was fed, that bridges were rebuilt after every crisis. That wasn't done in places like Europe. In Europe, we saw a descent into war, the 30 Years' War in Germany, with these famines and and led to pandemics afterwards. The Tokugawa regime survived. Japan survived relatively unscathed, with relatively low loss of life by the end of the century, unlike in China, in India, and in Europe. Lessons learned, folks. By the way, one secret lesson, which maybe we should be using in some places, was that when governors of different provinces in Japan did not follow the Tokugawa regime's requirement to open the grain stores and feed the poor when there was a collapse of agriculture, the governors were executed. I mean, okay, I'm not in favor of capital punishment, but I sort of quite like it. Maybe in the US now it could be useful. But look, let's leave that aside. The key point is resilience. Lauren, you're involved in Resilient Cities Network. Tell us about what needs to be done.
Thank you, Sean, for inviting me. I think I'm happy to provide the perspective on resilience and also to save you from having a manel, which I think in this day and age shouldn't be happening. But really glad to also be bringing the resilience perspective. So thank you for asking. I think when we talk about what it is that cities need in terms of building resilience, there are quite a few things. And just for those of you who aren't so familiar with us and wondering who is this woman and why is she talking about this, I'll just give you a little bit of context. Resilient Cities Network is the oldest and the leading city network working on holistic resilience, so working on responses to climate, to social and economic impacts for cities. And we work with about 100 cities globally, and 21 of those cities are in Asia and the Pacific. So we are experts in terms of helping cities to build capacity, to strategize, and then to try to leverage investment. And something that I always wonder, sitting here, and our headquarters is here in Singapore, is why we're not having an even more urgent conversation than we are. And this is obviously a regional meeting for climate bonds. 98 of the most vulnerable 100 cities to climate change are in this region. 98. And yet, just a tiny, tiny fraction of climate finance, bonds and otherwise, is coming to resilience and adaptation. And an even smaller fraction of that is coming to the subnational level. It's mostly going to the national level. So when we talk about these huge financial flows that are coming into climate, they're actually not coming in to the most vulnerable areas. Because no matter what we do in terms of net zero, and I think this is very clear from the IPCC report, which I now have been reading for 2 decades, like many of you, and they keep getting more and more urgent and more unsettling. No matter what we do in terms of net zero and targets, we are still going to be facing increasing climate impacts over the next decade that we need to prepare for. So when we talk about resilience, Sean, we need to be investing in the kind of infrastructure that keeps us safer. So cities, and I have the pleasure, as I mentioned, of working with about 100 of them, they actually need a much different kind of conversation and a much different kind of engagement when it comes to resilience finance. We see that the goals, even of very ambitious cities like Hong Kong or like Singapore, are setting aside large-scale finance for resilience. But that is happening really at a fraction of the level what we need. We can actually have a much better conversation if we are place-based in our conversations. Right before the pandemic, and I'll give you a little anecdote about this, I was sitting in Hong Kong with 4 of the largest real estate investors, with engineers, and with climate scientists. And the conversation was this: we are, as real estate developers, all going through the exercise of downscaling climate models for our new developments by ourselves, because we are not having a holistic conversation about what our risk is to storms and floods. And so we're doing this on our own. Couldn't we, and couldn't Resilient Cities Network help us to have a collective conversation about this and be engaging better together and doing something about the spaces in between? So one of the things that I think is really necessary when we talk about climate finance and mobilizing large capital is actually connecting the dots in a way that is place-based, looking at the place-based risk and opportunities and integrating these large flows of capital, in particular in the built environment, for net zero with upgrading our buildings. And this is not impossible, but it needs to be intentional. So when we're upgrading our building to reduce energy intensity, let's look at what we're doing in terms of absorbing rainwater, preparing for flood, or being resilient to storms. So we need to have these collective conversations, and we need to increase that ambition. I think the other thing that we need to do, and Kenneth mentioned this, and I was nodding, is build the enabling environment. Too often, we're looking at the deal. What was the flow of capital? What was that project? And how did we prepare that project? Rather than how did we prepare the people in the agencies who are going to need to prepare more of those projects, right? There's a really important conversation there, because right now what we risk doing, and I include all of us in this as we prepare individual kinds of interventions into a specific sector or set a specific target that we're going to mobilize X trillions for X purpose, is that we focus on that target rather than focusing on the who is going to have to keep addressing those targets, but rather keep taking those impacts. And so I think that that's where we really need to look at who is the essential community, what is the essential skill base that we need to build. And I think that that's a really exciting conversation in Asia. I've been working here for the last 20 years. And when I first started working here, we had to go to Australia to get the best downscaled climate models. We don't have to do that anymore. We have the Earth Observatory of Singapore. We have the Prime Minister's office and their climate change capabilities. And that kind of capability is also being grown all around the region. We also have amazing financial interventions that are happening. But connecting those dots in very specific ways needs to happen. And I will end on 2 points in that regard. I think we know where the most at-risk cities are in this region and how important they are to the economic health of our own region. So we need to focus there, really focus on building those capabilities there, and leveraging those existing capital flows to build in what we call in resilient cities the R value. Build in the resilience benefits and be really intentional about that kind of holistic design, development, and investment.
Fantastic, Lauren. Thank you. There's a lot to be done, right? And it's about getting the design right up front. I want to turn now to Michael about whether this is happening. Michael, earlier today we were fortunate enough to have Jane Fraser speaking to us from New York, the CEO of the Citigroup, who I have to say made a pretty good speech from my perspective about the extent to which Citi has committed. And the very first speech Jane Fraser made when she became CEO was around climate change. This is pretty unusual for a global financial institution, I have to say. What does this mean in practice? You're a public sector agencies banker in particular, and this session is about the role of government and so on. I'm curious to hear about the reception. What's actually happening out there? Your mission, as Jane Fraser said, is to help your client transition. Are you getting a ready hearing amongst the various public sector organisations that you're speaking with, mitigation, and from what Lawrence says, also resilience?
Thanks very much. The short answer is yes, we are getting response, but let me just make 4 points. First and foremost, energy transition, because that's what we're talking about, is hard. It is very hard, and it's much harder than I ever thought and most of my colleagues thought when we first got involved in this. But it's really critical. I mean, it's unbelievably critical that we do this. I have teenage daughters, and my eldest daughter said to me a couple months ago, he goes, you know, Dad, I'm really proud of you, but hurry up. And it's about the second point I want to make is that it's about to get harder. A lot of people miss this point. I think most of you know California said that by 2035 that they would no longer allow the sale of diesel or gas-powered vehicles. The problem is that nobody ever thought about the fact that if that's the case, in California alone, everything else being equal, the demand for power rises 30%. How in the world are we going to transition at the same time increase that power just for cars, not talking about any other of the increase in demand for anything else? And EV vehicles, I'm not against them, I'm all for them, but this is what I mean, but it's getting harder and harder all the time. Because it's not about transitioning just where we are now to something, you know, more green, but it's also how do we grow it at the same time. The third point, and this comes to your point, Sean, is that the governments have to get their head around the fact that they have to play a much, much, much bigger role in the financing. The private sector simply does not have the wherewithal at the present time to do that. And the reason being is that previously, and governments still have this attitude, and I'm not criticizing them, but they haven't gotten their head around this yet. In the past, when governments were involved, or multilaterals, or whoever else, it was about reducing risk on a project. The returns were there, but from finance, it's like, look, the return is there, but the risk is too high. You get down the risk, I'm fine with the financing. The problem with transition is that they have to reduce the risk, so they have to be involved. That's necessary, but not sufficient, because the returns are not high enough to attract private capital. So the governments still have not got their head around the fact that it's not just about reducing risk, it's also about putting in enough money in so that they might get a 1% return on their equity part, so that the big finance companies, the big investors, the pension funds can get 8 or 9% internal rate of return. They have not gotten their head around it yet, because the magnitude that you're talking about here, I know people are throwing around 50 billion, 100 billion of transfers from the developed countries. It's not enough. And it really comes down to trying to figure out how do we get blended finance, not just to reduce the risk, but to get the return attractive enough that the private sector will bail in. And we're not there yet. And it's really hard. I cannot emphasize to you how difficult it is to get something that actually works. And the final point I will just make is that we all need to have a much greater sense of urgency. And I always like to use this quote from Franklin Roosevelt, who was running for president in 1932 during the Great Depression. And he said, he called for bold, persistent experimentation. And that's really what we need to do. Nobody has figured this out. We need to try stuff, knowing that 70 or 80% of it's going to fail. But it's the only way we'll figure out what works and then move on to do the next thing. Because what my fear is in talking about this and being involved in it for 2 years now, the concern that I have is that the great is becoming the enemy of the good. We're trying to get it perfect. we can't figure out how to get it perfect yet or even close. So let's try anything, knowing that most of it's not going to work, but we take what does work and then we try the next one.
So we learn by walking rather than try and get it right up front. Fair enough. But have we seen enough action so far? I mean, you talk about urgency. You're saying it's hard, but at the same time, if we need to be people to just start trying it and doing it, where are we? And I mean, particularly with the resilience, like, I know Singapore's done a good job on water infrastructure, well, especially clean water infrastructure, which is brilliant. Their target on urban food is quite good, but I'm sure there are other things Lauren will tell us about in a minute. But around the region, this is, we've got a hell of a long way to go. Like, have we, in Bangkok, for example, taken measures to avoid a similar kind of flood impact than we had a few years ago, when we saw that major outage in the world IT industry as a result? How do we get this going, Michael? How do we get these deals out the door? Because, as you say, time is short. Give us a bit of hope here.
This may be no, I don't mean to be negative, because actually I'm quite positive, but what I'm trying to get the point across is that we just got to try stuff. And what seems to be happening is that, and I've seen this happen in infrastructure as well, public-private partnerships. They take forever. They just take a long time. So if you want to figure out what is going to happen or how it works, sometimes, and I know this is controversial, but sometimes the governments just have to go out and do it themselves and figure out what works. And the one example that seems to be happening, and I'm not directly involved in it, so I don't have the details, but in Poland, where the Poles are basically saying, no, we're buying the coal plants, and no, we're owning them, and we're going to decide when we shut them down and what the ramifications are, rather than waiting for private sector. And I encourage that, because we'll find out what works, and we'll find out how much it really costs, and we'll find out whether these other things work. What I find frustrating for me is that we keep running around and around public-private partnerships, and I'm not against those, but they are hard to put together, especially when the returns aren't there. How do you get the private sector in? And it's like, well, if the government says, well, I'm not going to do it unless the private sector's in, it's like, then you're not going to do it. I mean, it comes down to that, and I know that's not very positive sentiment, but I've been working on this stuff for 2 years, as has my team, and you can tell I'm slightly frustrated because it needs to be done, and we're just kind of talking shop after talking shop after talking shop.
Lauren, before I go to Shinichiro in Japan, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in the resilience space. Are people acting, public sector bodies actually acting, and what have we got to do?
So, in some ways, I would agree that governments are frustrated, and so they are just going and doing it by themselves. If you look at what's happening in New Zealand, after the earthquakes, they voted a rate rise in Wellington that looked at upgrading the water infrastructure, increasing the security of building facades at the same time, right? So this is happening, but this is happening in mature markets. So I think there is still a real moral hazard if we don't have a real conversation about decoupling what the private sector can come in and do alone and what the private sector can come in and do with blended finance. I agree that that's a really important point. But I also think the real conversation probably has to happen about the kinds of capital that are important to this discussion. So, we're here at a bonds meeting, right? Bonds and also the pension funds are extremely important players. And I'm actually starting to hear, not enough, I wish it was more, but some of the pension funds say, look, we're actually going to start to think about a different rate of return. Maybe it's not going to be 8. Because there's an equity issue here, right? The same funds that have made money before they were actually, taking the fossil fuels out of their portfolios are now taking a little bit more responsibility around the fact that these are the industries that have caused this issue. So we have to have a clear and open conversation about that this is something that we need to do. And I'm seeing some encouraging blended finance models where, and I am a recovering development banker, so just to make that very clear, I used to work at the Asian Development Bank, and so I had a lot of love for the slides and the detailed diagrams coming from Japan because I miss that. there is a lot more happening in terms of bringing in those loans instead of directly financing the government, especially in middle-income countries, to actually just taking the first risk or take first loss. And that's extremely important. We need to see more of that, and we need to see more of that spread out over the kinds of deals that are going to bring us adaptation or resilience benefits and decarbonization at the same time. We need to actually prioritize, Sean, the kinds of investments that are going to protect people. Because I would bet that if I asked in this room, how many people live in a city? Maybe everyone would raise their hand, right? How many people who live in a city actually think that their city or country is taking enough action to protect them from climate impacts? I would guess that nobody would raise their hand, right? So clearly there's a gap here, and we're seeing finance rush into the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, and that's not where we are. That's not the kind of action that's going to make our kids proud, right? We have to reach higher. We have to jump. So let's do that, and let's talk about the real financial mechanisms that allow us to do that.
Kenneth, I'd like to get you in a minute. I'm going to get you notes first, just to alert you, because Lauren raised the comment about property developers in Hong Kong. So I'll be interested to hear where your thinking's been going in the last couple of years about that. But Shinichi, first, if I might say, in Japan, METI, of course, is the organization, well, really, frankly, that guided Japan's recovery in the 50s and 60s. The super ministry of METI was incredibly successful at working closely with industry to drive change. I'm interested to know where that discussion is now, and also what is industry saying back to METI about what it's looking for the government to do in this particular crisis we're trying to face to ensure rapid change. What can you tell us about that conversation?
Yes, thank you, Sean. Yes, first of all, before answering your question, thank you for the Japanese history lesson you taught me about the Tokugawa. I didn't really know that. I'm now proud of the Tokugawa period. Yes, your question is about the yes, the role of METI in the 50s and 60s for the recovery, and what is our role in today in this landscape for the Japanese growth. And right now, after the announcement of carbon neutral 2050 2 years ago, everything has changed, and now this green transformation is the key word. And green transformation means we will do both the growth and also the decarbonization. It's going to happen both together. So this is a business opportunity, the growth opportunity, and this is a solution we will bring to the world. So that's how the perception completely changed. And that's why we are very seriously working on all the financial tool side also. And our observation is, there's 3 types of finance. It's for sustainable finance. There's green finance, like renewable, etc. It's finance for already green side. That's for the private sector to support. Then this is innovation finance, which is a government's role to support all the real risky innovation. But then in the middle is this transition finance. We have all these hard to abate sector who we don't want to leave it alone. We want them to transform. So that's why we're working on this transition finance very seriously. But one very serious issue we are working on in this transition finance is the concern on the financed emission. What is happening is the finance sector, the banks, the investors, they have to follow the norm by the G-funds and others and care about the financed emission, how much their clients going to emit. And so however, this transition finance, we're talking about hard to abate sectors. So the more you invest in this hard to abate sector for their serious transition, what happens temporarily is an increase of emission for the financiers. So so these kind of temporary increase to meet the long-term goal of carbon neutral, that has to be allowed, or there has to be some mechanism to disclose this kind of, explain this transition. Why is it temporarily increasing? But there is a commitment towards carbon neutral. So things are getting complicated, but we need to work on really face this hard-to-abate sector. We've already kind of done all the easy part, the low-hanging fruit. But it's now time to really tackle the hard part. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Yes, it's certainly in terms of global portfolios, we have a lot of investors who are now worried about the linear pathway model, who are trying to bring in high carbon companies into their portfolios that will throw out their reporting because they're going to look bad for a year or two, just as Sinisha said. And yet the change in the next 10 years will be tremendous. There's a company called Sasol in South Africa that I think is the world's most carbon intensive company. It's horrible. They make petrol out of coal, for God's sake. It really is bad. But they have a CEO that has got a whole lot of patents on green hydrogen. And he has a business plan which looks interesting. Now, I don't know if it's ambitious enough, but it's the sort of thing we've got to examine and critique, because if he can shift that company into new business lines quickly and keep supplying the customers, they're currently one of the world's largest supplier of hydrogen, produced from gas and so on, shifting to green hydrogen. We want that in our portfolio. But that requires putting in an incredibly high carbon company into a portfolio for the next couple of years, which would be very difficult. This is the challenge of transition, at least in the mitigation space, but maybe not so much resilience, where it's a little more straightforward. Kenneth, over to you. Tell us what your thinking is in the resilience space.
Well, actually, I smile when I heard about Lauren's story about conversation with the real estate developer, because we not so long ago had a similar conversation, but this time with the banks. The reason is that they were looking for data to manage and calculate climate risk, physical risk. And as you could imagine, in Hong Kong, a big part of banks' physical risk is exposure to mortgage loan. And as it turned out, that exercise is still not fully done. I don't know how many years after Lauren had that conversation with the real estate developer. And it's very difficult. We try to get the kind of granular data, granular enough for banks to really do proper risk assessment. Some of the data are at so the metaphorical underground vaults of some government department, which we dig out, but they were not very user friendly. So we're now basically cleaning them up. But there are also data that are residing with insurance company, for example. And those insurance companies are now kind of sitting together, hire a consultant, and group all those data together. And all these work takes a long, long time and very laborious. So it's more an observation than really a solution for that. I guess we just have to start somewhere, and we're working on it. But I'm not as pessimistic, I would say, as what what Michael said just now. I think progress are being made, and often at some less noticed areas. So say, for example, as the name of CBI suggests, a lot of the focus in green finance has been focusing on bond, but in this part of the world, for example, loan has been really big traditionally. And over the past 2-3 years, I can see that green loan really catch up. I think 3-4 years ago, there was hardly any green loan. But I think now with banks making even more commitment to convert their loan portfolio into green and sustainable category, that really catch up. Last year in Hong Kong, loan and bond basically are even in terms of issuance amounts. And this year with the bond market, as we all know, in pretty difficult situation, loan actually far exceed bond in Hong Kong. And I was just looking across the border in the Greater Bay Area in mainland China, just basically one province. And I think at the end of Q1 this year, outstanding green loan was something like 1.6 trillion RMB, whereas green bond outstanding was just 200 billion. I mean, you can argue whether all these green bonds, green loans really meet the kind of standard that some international investors are looking for, but I think that's a little bit beyond the point. The point is really that efforts are being made, and a lot of the efforts actually fell under the radar, and I think we should just kind of work on all of them.
Well, that's a regulator saying that. That's a central bank saying that, folks. Work on all of them. Now, that makes me excited. That gives me a bit of hope. It might even give Lauren a bit of hope. What do you think?
Despite my urgency, I am actually very hopeful about all of this. I think that the conversations are moving more quickly. And I'm actually very encouraged by the regional types of conversations that are happening. Because if you look at who provides finance to cities, 90% of it is coming from national actors, not international actors. So, building the capacity of regional and national actors and doing that in collaboration with global actors, but in an appropriate way, is happening. So I'm hopeful on that. I do think that the pace needs to increase dramatically. I think the kinds of conversations we need to be having and the kinds of capacity we need to be building is less general and more specific. And I mentioned that before, but I'll just say it again. I think patient capital has a really important role to play in the climate finance conversation. And I think where we're seeing the biggest flows coming in, is in the impact space, right? And the VC space, where people are rushing in, right? But in terms of philanthropy, less than 4% of philanthropy is on climate. I already mentioned the numbers in terms of financial flows.
Only
on a larger,
4%.
Yes. I know it seems like more, but it's not. So there's a huge need for the kinds of soft finance to join quicker with those proactive actors in the finance space from the private sector to target the most at-risk places. I think the Prime Minister of Barbados said it so eloquently during Climate Week in New York. She said, we're not interested in you guys coming to pay for the undertaker, right? Like, we don't want the insurance payout when everything's gone up, sideways. What we want is preferably the finance now in the places where it's needed most. So I think I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we're having this conversation today at the Singapore Stock Exchange, because I also think that, there's a distinct way that different regions want to manage this. And this is a region that is built on looking carefully, right, at what your risks are and preparing for them in a way that's data-driven and based on your savings and your capabilities. And I think that there is a really, really authentic regional way to build the response here, and it's starting to happen. And I'm very much looking forward to being here in Singapore, being part of those continued conversations, and hopefully staying connected to colleagues on screen as well. Kenneth, we could have a longer conversation about the Hong Kong real estate and banking downscaling and how to manage that. But I am very hopeful that the right kinds of conversations are happening, not just in auditoriums, but also in boardrooms here.
We need to wrap up, everyone. I'm going to ask Michael to summarize, or rather give us a bit of a last reflection in a minute as a banker. But first, I'm just going to ask Shinichi, from Japan's perspective, give us you're in the middle of a very tough process, which is wrestling with what the change is going to. I'm just curious to know a final reflection from you on the sense of energy and hope that you're seeing in Japan, and of course Japan's in the region. What's your view around that? How much energy, how energized do you feel? How energized do you think industry is? How hopeful are you?
Yes, thank you. Yes, we are very optimistic. Japan is always the champion of the technology, and the more we have the time, the more technology comes in. We're now buying time, doing many things, but eventually we do have a lot of options, including like hydrogen thermal power generation or ammonia thermal power generation, renewable energy, onshore, offshore wind, etc., carbon neutral solutions. Yeah, so they will come in. And we are very seriously supporting that as well. We have this 2 trillion yen Green Innovation Fund now allocated 90% already. So they're going to come in. So, and technology is always the silver bullet in this discussion. So we're very optimistic, and Japan is ready to support all of this challenge by providing all our technologies to the world. And we look forward to the secure and sustainable energy climate future. Thank you.
You just heard that from one of the most powerful ministries of economy in the world that's already driven the growth of Japan as a modern economy. Incredibly important words from you, Shinichi. Thank you so much. Kenneth, last word before I go to Michael.
No, I very much share what Lauren and Michael said just now about the need for urgency, and forum like today are useful for raising awareness and pushing things forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Michael.
The point I think I really want to make here is that the longer I've been involved in it, the more sense of urgency I have. So the frustration is not because I don't think things are being done. I want them to go faster. And I think that one of the challenges that we have is that, again, I don't think governments, and I'm not picking on anyone, but just in general and multilaterals haven't quite got their head around what needs to be done. And I think that once that thinking changes, and blended finance is the way to go, but it's got to be different than the blended finance that we're used to in the past. And then the private sector, once those returns are there and the risks are relatively low, the money will just pour in from a whole variety of places.
Sorry, did you just say the money will just pour in?
Mm-hmm.
You hear that, everyone? I heard that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is if the returns, they don't have to be the highest returns, they have to be reasonable returns. And especially if you're talking about pension funds, infrastructure funds, you don't have to have 20% returns. You have to have low single digits if you want to think of it as internal rates of return, something like that. Because people, have children. They know this is important, okay? But at the same time, if you're a pension fund and you have a fiduciary responsibility, you can't say, I'm going to put something in with 2% return when inflation is 8. That just ain't going to work. And then you're going to have a bigger problem 30 years from now when people retire. So it's a combination of things. So my frustration that you've heard in my voice is not because I don't think things are happening. It's because I have come to realize that they have to move a lot faster. I mean, a lot faster in order to get to where we need to go.
Fantastic. And of course, this is about risk and risk management, and this is about the risk of getting sustainable returns or losing them. And that's why investors around the world are keen, because they're concerned about matching their assets and liabilities in 20 years' time when you retire. Because if we don't have this problem addressed, they're going to have a great deal of difficulty. That applies to mitigation as well as resilience. Michael, I'm looking forward to working with you last year. As Jane said, sounds like we've got quite a deep partnership coming up, which hopefully means there'll be a lot of capital moving in the right direction. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Shinichi in Tokyo. Thank you, Kenneth in Hong Kong. Thank you, Lauren, for coming in at the last minute you did. And I want you to know 50% of all our panelists were women overall, even though this panel was very besuited with men. My apologies. And Michael, thank you very much. I'm going to invite up to the stage now to finish Harry Cho
Thank you.
to do a wrap-up. But please, look forward to a drink food before we leave if we can.